So in this video, I'm going to show you how my students use AI, but mostly not AI, to prepare their presentations. So I often think of presentations as being like an iceberg. That is, if it's a good presentation, that is a reflection of hours or days or weeks, months of work that went into it. So preparation is key. So my students kind of follow this general three-part step. So the first part is digital. Yes, they are using AI, Perplexity or ChatGPT or something else, and they're exploring. They're exploring and they're learning, they're asking questions, but also at the same time, they're acquiring. So they're acquiring the sources that they're going to use for the second step, the analog step, which is now that they have the books that they've identified or they've printed out some PDFs, they're going to slow down and they're going to engage in active learning, very slow reading. And the second step of this analog phase, which is very long, they're going to get organized using sticky notes or 3x5 cards or notebooks, whatever their preferred method is. And then finally, we go back to the digital, which is, of course, designing the slides or whatever you're using on the computer, and then spending some time rehearsing as well. So this analog sandwich kind of reminded me of a cheeseburger or a plant-based cheeseburger. The bun at the bottom is where we start. Relatively short time is spent there, but we are learning and we are, more importantly, getting the resources to go on to the second part, which is the analog, where we spend a lot of time reading and making connections and getting organized, and then finally going back to the computer to use something like slideware to get organized and create our visuals. But a lot of apps are saying, a lot of apps and a lot of chatter on things like Twitter and other social media are saying like, hey man, you can just start with AI. Let AI do it. You can just put in a few prompts and bingo, it's done. And you could do that just like you could have a cheeseburger with no meat or any vegetables, so just bread. You could do that, and it kind of looks like a cheeseburger in the same way that doing an automatic bunch of slides slapped together could sort of look like a presentation, but ultimately it's not very satisfying for the audience, not satisfying for the student, and it leaves a lot of us just kind of wondering what that was all about. Not very fulfilling for anyone. Okay, so here are the steps. Basically, three main steps. Oh, but actually four, because there's kind of a pre-step. Before we open up the computer and go with AI, I think it's really important to first sit down with a pen and a notebook and kind of just ask yourself, well, what do I know about this topic? And of course, make sure you understand the assignment. Think about your audience. Think about what you know already about this. This is sort of like in keeping with the Feynman method of first choose a topic and then write down what you know about it already, which might be not very much at this time. That's fine. And then we can go on to the first step, which is opening up an AI app and learning. You're exploring, you're asking questions, summarize some things. I think NotebookLM is really good for this, but Perplexity is also really good. So my students are using, at least at the time I'm making this video, my students are using Perplexity. And the great thing about Perplexity and other apps like it is that, of course, there's still some hallucination there, but it's really good at showing you the sources of that information. So through this, of course, students get the sources that they need. You can even ask directly for what's the best book, for example, on this topic. They identify those. If it's some PDFs or some websites, sometimes they like to print them because they just find that it's more sort of relaxing to do that and spend some time away from technology to actually learn. Okay, so at the end of step one then, we've got our reading material, so we can move on to step two, which is analog. And that's where we're going to read. Now, reading is not the only way, of course, to get information or to learn, but it's the primary way in this case. And I have a bias towards liking paper books, and a lot of my students also do. Even they're on screens all the time, so it's kind of a nice break to get away from that and just read, and not so much underlying, but using this time to ask yourself questions and make connections as you're reading. So it is a very long process. It takes time. They need to reflect on what they're reading, take notes for themselves in their own words, knowing that they might use it later. The idea of underlining has maybe some utility, but it's not the best way. I think it's much better to take notes in your own words as you're doing the reading, all the while knowing in the back of your mind that you're going to use this information for using 3x5 cards or sticky notes. But the key is to write down your notes in your own words. Make sure you understand it. It's much better that way than just copying things down. So I do introduce to my students the idea of sort of using the Socratic method to test yourself, right? The Socratic method for self-learning. So students learn to slow down, ask themselves questions, try to make connections with what they're reading, maybe make connections between authors or different books or different materials that they're reading. And it's really a time for reflection as well. And this is consistent with an idea from a great book that I recommend. Perhaps you've read it already, called Make It Stick. And as they said, when the mind has to work, learning sticks better. So rather than just underlying things and then or rereading, they work on active retrieval from their own brains, and that really helps them to understand it in their own words, and it's much more sticky that way. And other things that we talk about to help them in the analog phase are things like active recall, where they test themselves periodically as they're reading the material, interleaving, which means mixing different aspects, same general topic, but different aspects of the topic. They can get some variety, mix it up. And then, of course, spaced repetition. For me, what I'm really telling them is don't wait until 2 or 3 days before, or let alone the night before. It's impossible. So give yourself, I give them a lot of time. Actually, they have many weeks, or at least a month actually, before their big presentation. So they're spending a lot of time just reading. Spaced repetition also reflects the idea of how important sleep is. So you might really work hard to learn as much as you can using active recall. Then when you sleep at night, that's really when a lot of learning is going on. The brain is not off when we're sleeping. And this is something we talk about in the class. And then step 2, or part 2 rather, of step 2 is getting organized. So you've taken all those notes that you wrote down. Maybe you wrote them directly on Post-it notes and put that in a notebook. That's fine. Some people prefer 3x5 cards. Personally, I'm a sticky notes guy or a Post-it notes guy. I use it on a whiteboard to get the big picture and to move things around. Also in my notebook. So this is one of my notebooks that has little spaces for 8 Post-it notes per page. And I can organize these, and as I'm reading and as students are reading, they write little notes down for themselves, thinking about that presentation that's coming up. And then in this step, we can kind of get organized with these. So here's an example. In this step 2, part 2 of step 2, an example would be, let's say it's a problem solution presentation. So we have our problem and we have a solution, or our ideas to deal with this. And that's the main hunk, but we need an introduction and then the next step. The next step is like a conclusion, but it isn't really the conclusion because that sounds like the end. We want the audience to do something. There's a call for action, for example. So we take that information, all these notes that we did as we were reading, and we try to get organized with them, right? So we have some ideas for our intro and different problems. I have that down, and some different ideas for the solution, and then the next step. And some people prefer to use 3x5 cards. That works fine as well. But I do it this way. So I use the sticky notes, and a lot of my students use sticky notes as well. So now we go to step 3. So now we're back to the computer using Keynote or PowerPoint or whatever you use. And so this can be a really fun process. We've done the hard work, we've done the learning, but now it's time to bridge a gap. So we want to go from that analog world with our sticky notes or whatever we were using. We go from analog to digital. So here's our analog sticky notes, and now we can go to PowerPoint or Keynote, something like this. So let's say it's a problem solution presentation, as I said. So the topic will be, let's say, plastic pollution and the impact of that plastic pollution on marine life. So there's our title, let's say drowning in plastic. And I had an idea, let's say I'm a student, and I have an idea for my introduction. I'll talk about when I went to Ishigaki in Okinawa, and which is a very beautiful place, but there's a bit of a problem with all the plastic that washes up from the Japan Sea. So that's my kind of introduction. Maybe I have some data there that's sort of surprising. Then I go into the problem. And the problem, I'm going to just organize it with like 3 major chunks. These pink and yellow and green and orange slides will be hidden. These are just here for now getting organized, but later on we won't see those. So for section 1, let's say I'm going to talk about how much plastic are we talking in the world, and I have some data on that. And section 2 will be on the causes. Well, why? Why do we find so much plastic now compared to years before? Where is it, and so on? And then what is the impact of all this plastic, the microplastics and so on? What is the impact on humans? But for the most part, we'll focus on what is the impact for marine life. right? So I have those 3 chunks and then I just build it out. So maybe the first one on how much plastic, maybe there's 10 slides for that. The second hunk maybe, or chunk, rather, the second chunk maybe has, 3 or 4 slides, or it could be 10 slides, whatever. But it's basically organized into 3 sections. And then same thing for solutions. And it doesn't have to be 3, it could be 4, but you don't want too many. And the same idea. So in this case, I focus on, let's say, international initiatives to deal with the problem. I focus on Japan initiatives. And then also I have a section on, well, what can you do in the audience? What can you do to try to help with this problem? And then of course I can just build that out, right? So I have my 3 sections, but then I can start building it out step by step. Again, this is not something you do overnight. It's something you take time with. You go from your sticky notes where you're already organized to gradually build up your deck slide by slide. And then the final one on the next step is sort of our conclusion. So let's say I can recommend a couple of best-selling books on the topic for the audience. And then a website, maybe there's this United Nations website that is very useful that I want them to go to. But maybe I put that right at the end. So maybe I have a Q&A session right at the end. And then the final thing, rather than just a thank you, I give them another thing. Maybe it's a website with a QR code on it so that they can go there later. So now we're ready for the presentation, ready to do a great job. So again, just to summarize, we have digital, analog, digital, sort of like a cheeseburger, if you want to think of it that way. But the key thing is that section in the middle, is that analog section. That's really where the learning is going. I mean, what's the whole point of a presentation anyway? Having students do presentations, yes, they'll learn presentation skills, but the real point is also to learn how to learn and to learn the material so that they can share that with others, but also retain it themselves. So in terms of how much time this takes, that really just depends on how much time that you have. But as a percentage, like I say, before you start using AI, there's just a little bit where we ask ourselves, what do I already know about the topic? But the exploring and discovery and the acquiring the resources stage is relatively shorter. We spend a long time reading and learning and taking notes and engage in active recall and so on. And then organizing. So using the Post-it notes or a notebook, whatever you're using, is very useful, but it takes time. And then you're going to spend a pretty good deal of time back in the computer, going from analog to digital again. So I would say all in all, right now, as of this date, the Perplexity or NotebookLM or ChatGPT have been really useful for students. They're not using it to cheat. It's really difficult to cheat a presentation anyway. And if you did, you're only cheating yourself, and we would know what's the point of that. The students really love the idea of taking some time after they've found their sources. AI really gets them up to speed, so they know the topic, but then they find that actually having a book or two, or at least some chapters from certain books where they can slow down and really think about the material, is really much more fulfilling for them when they present that. All right, everyone, thank you for watching this video and for staying all the way until the end. So, I never say thank you for liking and subscribing to this channel. And of course, if I said that in the body or in the beginning, I'd get a lot more subscriptions and a lot more engagement, I suppose. But I just don't want to say that in my videos. But I do appreciate it, and so I am asking you now if you wouldn't mind a like or a comment or subscribing to the channel if you are interested in the presentations and approach to presentation, to filmmaking, to video creation, and so on. If you're interested in storytelling in a different context, then yeah, please do subscribe. I'd love to have you on board. If you have any comments or about this particular video, especially if you're sharing your own ideas, how you're using AI along with analog, then yeah, please do feel free to comment. I read them all, and I really do appreciate your comments and your subscriptions. All right, thanks very much, and we'll see you in the next video. Aloha.